American Orville Wright was first to fly in a power-driven airplane. On September 17, 1903, at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, he flew 120 feet in 12 seconds in his machine, the Flyer. Gabriel Vincent of France experimented with gliders at Berck-sur-Mer in 1905. He later used pontoon-fitted gliders at Billancourt and Lake Geneva. Alberto Santos Dumont, one of the great pioneers in aviation, flew 200 feet before formal observers from the Aero Club of France at the Bagatelle Cavalry Grounds in Paris on October 23, 1906. He bettered this performance on November 12th with 270 feet in 7 1/2 seconds and 721 feet in 21 2/5 seconds. On November 13, 1907, Paul Cornu lifted himself and his helicopter-type machine a few inches with a 24-horsepower motor. On June 7, 1907, President Theodore Roosevelt flew with Orville Wright. In congratulating Wright on his achievements, the President expressed his belief in the importance of the future role of aviation to the world. Aviation was born in America, but it was in Europe, and particularly in France, that it had its greatest early growth. In addition to the accomplishments of Vincent and Santos Dumont, Maurice and Henri Farman were early airplane builders as well as pilots. In 1908, in France, Léon Lavasseur built the Antoinette, one of the best-known and most reliable aircraft of its day. It was a monoplane powered by a 58-horsepower engine. Rebuffed at home, the Wright brothers demonstrated their Wright Flyer near Le Mans, France on August 8, 1908. Disbelief in the Wright claims was dispelled, and the plane was purchased by France. After France, Italy was one of the first European countries to become interested in aviation. On February 9, 1909, Delagrange of Rome formed an aviation club and invited Wilbur Wright to bring his plane to Rome to give flying lessons to Umberto Savoia, Prince of Italy, and Mario Calderara, who was to become one of Italy's most famous aviators. Santos Dumont, during September 1909, exhibited his aircraft, the Demoiselle. An aviation meeting was held by the champagne industry in August 1909 in France. Henri Farman won the distance prize. Subsequently, in France, multi-winged airplanes were constructed to accommodate heavier loads, but they were abandoned because of their inefficiency. On July 25, 1909, the French pilot Louis Blériot was first to fly the English Channel from Calais to Dover and won a prize of 4,000 francs. The Blériot single-seater high-winged monoplane used on this flight is now exhibited at the Museum of Arts and Crafts in Paris. It was powered by a single air-cooled engine. On March 8, 1910, Baroness Dremont de la Roche became the first woman to receive a pilot's license. Also in March 1910, the first hydroplane was built by the French engineer Henri Fabre and flown over the Bay of Marseille. Nicknamed the Canard, or Duck, it was powered by a 50-horsepower engine and weighed over 800 pounds. On September 23, 1910, Peruvian Georges Chavez was first to cross the Alps. On May 31, 1910, the American Glenn Curtiss flew his June bug from Albany to New York City at an average of 50 miles per hour and won a prize of $10,000. In 1910, the first passenger plane, the L'Albassar, was constructed in France. In August 1912, Samuel Cody won the British military airplane competition with his towering biplane, the Flying Cathedral. U.S. Army Captain Albert Berry made the first parachute jump from the Benoist biplane of Tony Janis near St. Louis, Missouri on March 1, 1912, at an altitude of 1,500 feet. In September 1913, the French pilot Adolphe Pégoud became the world's first master of aerobatics, performing the loop and other evolutions. Pégoud's flying ability induced airplane builder Louis Blériot to develop new techniques. These experiments were conducted in 1913 under the auspices of the French Navy, with the idea of the future use of aviation in naval warfare. Later the same year, in France, Adolphe Pégoud parachuted from his Blériot airplane as the plane crashed. The year of 1914 marked the dawn of aerial warfare with the start of World War I. The bombing raids and air battles, though important in the outcome of the war, were even more important for the glimpse they gave of the future. The lesson was clear. If you hold the air, you cannot be beaten. If you lose the air, you cannot win. In 1919, Glenn Curtiss made plans for an Atlantic crossing for the U.S. Navy Department. On May 6, 3 Navy Curtiss flying boats, the NC-1, NC-3, and NC-4, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Bellinger and Commanders Towers and Reed, took off from Far Rockaway Station, Long Island, New York, on the 1,000-mile flight to Trepassey Bay. On the way to Newfoundland, the 3 aircraft encountered bad weather. NC-4 developed engine trouble and made an emergency landing in the water about 100 miles from Chatham, Massachusetts. The other 2 planes reached Halifax, Nova Scotia in 19 hours, leaving the next day for Trepassey. On May 8th, they were ordered to proceed to the Azores. Bad weather forced Reed to land at Fayal in the Azores after a flight of 1,380 miles. Finally, after a week's delay due to weather, Commander Reed and his NC-4 flew 925 miles to Lisbon in 9 hours and 45 minutes. Flying time for the entire 2,400 miles was 25 hours and 1 minute. 2 weeks after the Curtiss flight, 2 Englishmen, John Alcock and Arthur Whitten Brown, made the first non-stop transatlantic flight. They flew from Newfoundland to Ireland in 16 hours and 12 minutes and won the 10,000-pound Daily Mail prize. On August 25, 1919, the world's first daily commercial air service started, connecting London to Paris in a 2.5-hour flight. Also in 1919, Gianni Caprani of Italy built the first transatlantic passenger airplane, the GA-60. This plane was powered by 8 engines with a total of 3,000 horsepower. Its empty weight was over 30,000 pounds, and it could carry a load of over 26,000 pounds. Its height was more than 30 feet, its length over 70 feet, and its wingspan was over 90 feet. It could carry 100 passengers comfortably at an average speed of almost 80 miles per hour. After a few initial flights, it crashed, and because of the rebuilding and maintenance costs, the project was abandoned. On January 8, 1920, Arturo Fararin took off from Rome and flew across Russia, Siberia, Tibet, China, and India, finally reaching Tokyo on March 11th after flying over 11,000 miles in 109 hours. The Japanese chopped down valuable trees in a national park to prepare an airport for him. The honors that the Japanese bestowed on him lasted 42 days. His airplane is displayed in the National Museum of Tokyo. In November 1923, the Italian pilot, Francesco J. Pinedo, returned to Italy in his hydroplane Savoia Marchetti S-16, nicknamed the Gennaiello. His 370-hour trip from Italy to Australia to Tokyo covered a distance of 33,000 miles and included 80 stops. In 1926, Commander Richard Byrd and his pilot, Floyd Bennett, were the first men to fly over the North Pole in the Josephine Ford, a Fokker triplane. They had to navigate without a compass, since this instrument is not usable close to the magnetic pole. In addition, they did not have ground navigational reference points. To add to their problems, the airplane began to lose power from one of the engines on May 9th at 9:02 a.m. Nevertheless, 16 hours after takeoff, the Josephine Ford landed safely at the original departure point of Kings Bay, Spitsbergen. In the reception committee were the Norwegians and Italians, who 3 days later were to fly above the North Pole in their dirigible Norge. At 9:50 a.m. on May 11th, 1926, the dirigible Norge left Kings Bay with a crew of 16 men, commanded by the Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen and his Italian companion Umberto Nobile. The Norge was a dirigible of a semi-rigid type, carrying over 600,000 cubic feet of hydrogen. It had a length of 347 feet, a height of 85 feet, and a maximum speed of 60 miles per hour. At 1:13 p.m. on May 11th, the Norge crossed the North Pole. The crew placed two flags, the Italian and the Norwegian. Flying at an average altitude of 2,500 feet against storms and fog, and at an average speed of 50 miles per hour, the Norge reached Nome, Alaska on May 14th. The Schneider Cup, an international race for seaplanes, was organized in 1913 by Count Jacques Schneider and given to the nation that could 3 consecutive times attain the best flying time in a closed circuit of 150 nautical miles. In November 1926, in Norfolk, Virginia, the race was won by Major Mario Di Bernardi of Italy at a speed of 246 miles per hour. In 1928, Di Bernardi broke his own record with a speed of 320 miles per hour in his Mach-E racing aircraft. The American Charles August Lindbergh was the best known and most popular of the transoceanic pilots. On May 20, 1927, at Roosevelt Field in New York, all existing conditions were bad for Lindbergh. An overloaded airplane, a muddy field, bad weather, an engine unable to reach the desired RPM, and a tailwind. All undesirable elements for a successful takeoff. In spite of these adversities, Lindbergh took off on a flight that was a continuous battle against bad weather and which lasted for 33 hours and 33 minutes. Lindbergh accomplished his transatlantic flight in a Ryan NYP monoplane, nicknamed the Spirit of St. Louis, which was powered by an air-cooled Wright Whirlwind 9-cylinder radial engine with 220 horsepower. On May 21, at the Le Bourget Airport in Paris, he received a prize of $25,000, offered by the French millionaire Ramon Ortegue. Upon his return to the United States, Lindbergh was officially received by President Coolidge, and the city of New York gave him a ticker tape parade. On June 4, 1927, U.S. pilot Clarence Chamberlain and his financial supporter Charles Levine flew from New York toward Berlin, Germany. Although a navigational error made them fly past the German capital, their 3,911-mile non-stop flight was a record-breaker. Their aircraft was the Belenka Columbia, powered by a single air-cooled Wright Whirlwind engine. On May 31st, 1928, Arturo Ferrarin and Carlo Del Prete won a prize for staying in the air 58 hours with an extremely heavy load. A little over a month after this test, on July 3rd, 1928, they took off from Rome for Natal, Brazil, a distance of 4,457 miles, with a load of 6,800 pounds. They made the flight in 48 hours and 14 minutes, giving Italy a record for time and distance with a load of this size. Also on May 31st, 1928, 4 men, Australians Charles Kingsford Smith and Charles Ohm, and Americans Harry Lyons and James Warner, took off from Oakland, California in a second-hand Fokker Atlantic and Pacific aircraft. With stops in Hawaii and the Fiji Islands, they reached Brisbane, Australia on June 9th. This type of airplane, with long-range capabilities of 4,000 miles and speeds of 100 miles per hour, is still used in many countries. In 1928, Great Britain produced the Beardmore Roarback Inflexible, an all-metal 3-engine cantilever monoplane powered by 3 Rolls-Royce engines of 650 horsepower each. 'The In 1928, Juan de la Cierva of Spain made his first successful flights in an autogyro, the C-4 at Getafe, Spain, then again at Madrid. The autogyro could take off with a very short run and could land almost vertically. This helicopter-like craft had a speed in excess of 100 miles per hour and could land in a very small area. November 1, 1928, marked the golden era of the dirigibles. The first and most famous of them all was the Graf Zeppelin. On November 1, 1928, the Graf Zeppelin, commanded by Dr. Hugo Eckener, considered the father of modern semi-solid dirigibles, won the world distance record in a straight line for this type of aircraft with a distance of 3,830 miles non-stop. This world record has never been beaten by a dirigible. The Graf Zeppelin was 770 feet long and had a diameter of 116 feet at its widest point. It was propelled by 4 engines of 550 horsepower each, and it flew at a speed of 70 miles per hour. On its maiden flight, it was loaded with a strange cargo, including hundreds of birds from the Canary Islands and a rare gorilla. It also carried 1,320 pounds of first-class mail. The success of this airship was due to its large cargo capacity. It was equipped with 10 comfortable cabins, complete with berths, and the meals were prepared by world-famous chefs. The Graf Zeppelin took approximately 111 hours to cross the ocean, and it made the trip 148 times. 38 crew members cared for the 20 passengers, who paid 10 times the fare of a normal ocean crossing. Newspapers throughout the world considered the dirigible the ideal means of transportation. In Germany, on September 30th, 1929, Fritz von Opel flew a rocket-propelled glider launched from a cradle which reached a speed of 100 miles per hour in the first flight by reaction propulsion. On September 2nd, 1930, Captain Duodun Coste and Maurice Ballant took off from Le Bourget Airport in Paris on a non-stop flight to New York in a single-engine, 2-seater biplane nicknamed the Question Mark. Due to intense headwinds and bad weather, their 37-hour flight used 1,000 gallons of fuel. On May 27, 1931, Auguste Piccard ascended to 51,700 feet in a pressurized cabin lifted by a balloon. It had previously been impossible for a human being to achieve this altitude because of lack of oxygen. On June 23, 1931, in the United States, the American ex-parachute jumper Wiley Post and the Australian Harold Gatty undertook for the first time in an airplane a trip around the world. This was done previously by the dirigible Graf Zeppelin in 21 days and 4 hours. On the first leg of the trip from the U.S., Post and Gatty landed at Le Bourget Airport outside Paris, having made a safe crossing at an average of 130 miles per hour. At Tempelhof Airport outside Berlin, the 2 pilots were received with the same enthusiasm as were Chamberlain and Levine 4 years earlier. The 2 men continued their trip across Russia and the wasteland of Siberia. Facing storms, fog, and bad weather, they continued their flight under the worst possible conditions and in sub-zero temperatures. At some points, they had to reach altitudes of 16,000 feet in order to cross the mountainous barriers of Asia. Their airplane, a Lockheed Vega, the Winnie Mae, was sponsored by Mr. Hall, a petroleum magnate. It covered 15,500 miles in 8 days, 15 hours, and 51 minutes. On their final lap at Winnipeg, Canada, they received an enthusiastic welcome by many dignitaries, among them Colonel and Mrs. Charles Lindbergh. As part of war reparations, Germany gave the United States the dirigible Graf Zeppelin, which entered service in the United States Navy in 1924 and served for 15 years. It was renamed Los Angeles. Its length was 721 feet, and it carried 2,460,000 cubic feet of helium. This dirigible made 331 training flights for a total of 4,320 hours. Because of its unusual capabilities, the United States constructed 2 more dirigibles named Akron and Macon. These dirigibles had a capacity of over 6 million feet of helium and a length of over 852 feet. They were propelled by 8 engines with 560 horsepower each. These dirigibles could each carry 5 airplanes with a range of over 6,000 miles at a speed of 95 miles per hour. Each airplane was hooked up to the dirigible by a special trapeze under the hull, and the planes could be released or rehooked at will while the dirigible was in flight. The Dornier DOX airline super flying boat of German construction has a separate place in aviation history. Because of its comfort, it was a yacht more than an airplane. Equipped with 12 motors in tandem on the wings, with 525 horsepower each, it could fly at a speed of 150 miles per hour. The motors could, if necessary, be repaired during flight. A team of 6 mechanics had access to each of the motors through a narrow corridor. The 60 passengers had a space of 54 square feet each. There was room to dance. The meals were served on china dishes, and each passenger had a chair and a bed. There were no safety belts. The only restriction was that the passengers remain seated during takeoff. This 40-ton airship had a crew of 16 men, half of whom were exclusively for the well-being of the passengers. The first flight from Germany to the United States took place in September 1931. Unfortunately, the high operating costs, the many motors, and the synchronization problems put an end to this experiment. On October 23, 1934, pilot Francesco Agello succeeded in bringing the absolute speed record back to Italy by attaining 440.5 miles per hour. For 5 years, until March 30th, 1939, Agello retained the speed laurels. His plane was a Macchi Castoldi MC-72, powered with 2 water-cooled Fiat 12-cylinder engines, one behind the other, with reciprocal air screws of 2,800 horsepower each. On July 1st, 1933, Marshal Italo Balbo took off with 100 pilots flying 24 Savoia Marchetti S-55 flying boats. These airplanes were powered by 2 Isetto Fraschini engines of 750 horsepower each. In the annals of aviation, This was the first time that an entire squadron crossed the North Atlantic. Their itinerary from Italy was Great Britain, Iceland, Canada, Chicago, New York, Azores, Lisbon, and back to Italy. The 24 planes were welcomed in Chicago by over 1 million cheering spectators. The world press described the event as the greatest accomplishment in aviation. In 1934, the Russians built a giant airplane called the Maxim Gorky, powered by 8 engines and weighing 58 tons. It had a wingspan of 206 feet. On January 20th, 1935, James Doolittle of the United States covered the coast-to-coast distance from Los Angeles to New York, carrying 10 passengers in 11 hours and 59 minutes. In 1935, the French airmail service began to carry mail between France and South America in a tri-engined airplane.
On November 22nd, 1935, Pan American Airlines inaugurated overseas flights across the Pacific. The elegant 23-ton Clipper reached an altitude of 18,000 feet and carried 46 passengers in great comfort. In 1937, the service was extended to the Philippines, and the Clipper was nicknamed China Clipper. The route extended over 8,500 miles to the mainland of Asia. On June 26, 1936, the DC-3 was introduced. These airplanes, manufactured by Douglas Aircraft for American Airlines, were for the first time in the history of aviation capable of 3 primary prerequisites: safety, speed, economy. Originally powered by 2 900 engines, some of the DC-3s flew for over 70,000 hours without a major overhaul. Douglas built over 11,000 DC-3s. Some of these planes are still flying today and have carried over 600 million passengers. Larger and more luxurious than its predecessor, Graf Zeppelin, the Hindenburg was the last of the rigid-type dirigibles. 60 crew members looked after the welfare of the passengers of its 72 cabins, all equipped with showers, hot and cold running water, and other amenities. This dirigible was powered by 4 diesel engines developing 1,100 horsepower, and it cruised at a speed of approximately 80 miles an hour. It crossed the North Atlantic in approximately 45 hours. On September 2nd, 1936, the American pilot Dick Merrill, accompanied by the singer Rich Man, crossed the Atlantic from the United States to Great Britain non-stop in 18 hours and 48 minutes. On the return trip, on September 14th, 1936, they covered the same route, a distance of 3,200 miles, in 17 hours and 44 minutes. On October 22nd, 1937, Colonel Mario Pezzi won the world altitude record in an airplane for Italy, reaching an altitude of 56,048 feet. This record was kept for approximately 10 years, until 1948, and was then captured by Great Britain. on November 30th, 1941, in a jet plane manufactured by Caproni Aircraft Company in Italy, the Italian pilot Mario Di Bernardi flew from Milan to Rome and returned. The speeds of the jet plane were 130 miles an hour and 70 miles an hour, respectively. Shortly afterwards, the same jet flew at a speed of over 300 miles an hour at an altitude of approximately 20,000 feet. It was in the early hours of September 1st, 1939, that the Second World War broke out. And in that catastrophe, aviation, by now 30 years old, was to become, sadly enough, the staunch ally of death. Flying techniques had progressed to a point where the air arm was often to prove a deciding factor, and behind those battling squadrons lay all the experience that had previously been gained by civil aviation. On the other hand, the war brought with it a wealth of experience which it would have needed a much longer period to acquire in peacetime. And this was to the great benefit of aviation, which was now able to apply new techniques to the advantage of the civil sector. For instance, even before the war ended, the limitations of the old piston engine were widely recognized. This led to the adoption of the jet engine, which had been designed and tried out in previous years, but had not yet been put to practical use. Another sector to develop enormously in wartime, and to the subsequent advantage of civil aviation, was aircraft instrumentation. Because of the great contribution it has made to flight safety, radar undoubtedly has a place among the major benefits that science has given to mankind. And greater safety has meant that aviation now influences, conditions, and even determines certain aspects of civil life. Take helicopters. They have been brought to such a pitch of perfection that they are almost unrivaled in many branches of flying. Today, flying is said to be within everyone's reach. In some countries, people have learned to use aeroplanes before knowing how to ride a bicycle. We fly for purposes of work, for pleasure, or just for the joy of being airborne. Air tourism is becoming increasingly widespread, and in Alaska and parts of Africa, the aeroplane is used in much the same way as a car. In fact, in those countries, certain journeys can only be made by air. As in the early days, many of the best pilots started flying as a hobby, and it is a hobby that is becoming increasingly popular. With modern technology what it is, there is no limit to the imagination where flying is concerned. Having long since shed their propellers, airplanes with swept-back wings now look more and more like rockets, and it is here that the future of aviation lies. The race to be first in the field, to do better than last time round, goes on unchecked. New planes of vast size transport their passengers and freight at speeds that no one dreamed of until a few years ago. This has made it possible to reduce the cost of air travel, to give, as it were, a new dimension to our way of life. It is by these means that economic barriers which have stood in the way of contacts between the peoples of one continent and another can be abolished. What then? Commercial missiles, giant rockets taking hundreds of passengers to any part of the world in a matter of minutes? Man's dream, prompted by watching birds in flight, has become a reality. Man, too, can soar aloft. He, too, is master of the skies, of limitless space, offering as never before a vast training ground in which to prepare for new ventures, new conquests.